Hey, gang, this week's episode is brought to you by Old Fort Baseball Company. Hey, if you know, you know. Fort Wayne, Indiana, a cradle of forgotten sports memories. Check them out at oldfortbaseballco.com and use the promo code GOODSEATS for 15% off. You have memories of the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League? How about indoor soccer? Maybe even pro softball. Can you believe it? And the Continental Basketball Association. All those memories and more. Great shirts, great caps, great everything at oldfortbaseballco.com. Promo code GOODSEATS for 15% off. And now, here's our show.
In 1946, in spring training with the Giants in Florida, I had an argument with the management over a contract, and I was denied the right to sign another. I accepted a previous offer from the Mexican League for $7,000. For this, I was banned for 5 years from working at my profession.
Baseball authorities, without exception, insist that the game could not continue without the reserve clause. Now, what would be the result if the courts were to determine the reserve clause illegal? All 400 players in the major leagues would be thrown on the open market as free agents at the end of each season. The wealthy clubs would grab the stars, and the poorer ones would take what was left.
Welcome to Good Seats Still Available, a curious little podcast devoted to exploring what used to be in professional sports. Here's your host, Tim Hanlon.
All right, settle down, everyone. I'll explain. How are you? My name's Tim Hanlon. It's Good Seats Still Available. It's the curious little podcast that we like to do for you each and every week that's focused on this little genre we've created for ourselves around what used to be in professional sports. Thanks for finding us. If you're new to the proceedings, welcome. And if you're a return listener, thanks for coming on by again. We appreciate it. Topic this week is a very interesting one, and I learned a ton, and hopefully you will enjoy and learn as well as much as I did. And we're going to be talking about a guy who is often forgotten, but is a crucial component of where professional baseball and arguably professional sports players kind of sit today in terms of their multi-million-dollar contracts and their free agencies and those kinds of things. The guy's name was Danny Gardella, and he was a player in Major League Baseball during the mid-1940s. This is around the war, 1944 in particular, playing for the New York Baseball Giants. And this is a guy who had a blip of a minor league career a few years earlier, had pretty much given up on the sport, was working as a dock worker in Jersey City, of all things, in the early 1940s, and playing on the side, as were a number of players of significant skill, but had to hold down day jobs if the pro baseball career either wasn't working out, like in Danny's case, or just wasn't even an idea or a possibility given life circumstances. But Gardella was rediscovered, if you will, by a guy named Mel Ott, very famous player and coach for the New York Baseball Giants and other things in baseball, of course, and worked himself up relatively quickly after being rediscovered through a couple of weeks with the local minor league team affiliate of the New York Giants, the Jersey City Giants, in the old Roosevelt Stadium there. And in 1944 and 45 was pretty much a star, a standout with the Giants ball club, known for some acrobatic plays, and he would do all kinds of sort of things on the sidelines and stuff. He was quite the attention grabber and a pretty darn good hitter too. Had a whole ton of home runs and runs batted in and stuff. And he kind of had a bit of thing going on for himself. And by the way, was really indicative of some chances that a lot of players ordinarily wouldn't have gotten if not for a bunch of them having gone to the war to serve their country, either in draft or volunteer form. So Gardella, arguably was probably one of the chief beneficiaries of a second wind, if you will, for his career, and was doing pretty darn good for himself until the end of the 1945 season, when he didn't he was offered a contract again to come back for 46. But he didn't feel he was really getting enough love for the 2 years that he was standing out for the team. So he held out and was hoping in spring training in 46 to get a chance to kind of renegotiate, maybe earn a little bit more than what the Giants had offered him. He felt it kind of insulting, frankly. It wasn't much of a pay raise at all. Well, it's interesting because in 1946, the war was over and you had players coming back into the major leagues. So in some respects, Gardella was not in the strongest negotiating position. Some of the best players were coming back. Some of them still had their skills and were still in their prime. And Gardella, who obviously was standing out when there was a less of a player pool, kind of found himself maybe having a harder time trying to stand out. So he and a number of other players essentially skipped out and went to a very aggressively situated Mexican league that was starting to offer some pretty sizable amounts of money to players who were either not enthralled with their current doings in the major leagues of the United States or for other reasons. And that's kind of the center of our conversation. He was known as a league jumper, Gardella was. And as you'll hear in our conversation with this week's guest, Robert Elias, who's got a great new book out on this topic, you're going to hear, like Danny said in the beginning, he was essentially blackballed by this organized baseball sort of cadre, if you will, that essentially had the reserve clause in place. And in essence, players like Gardella had to either take the offer or leave it. And for the first time in a long time since the Federal League or the Players League and other leagues, there was this Mexican league that was stepping up with some real dough to give players an option, and Gardella jumped at that chance. And by the way, this was like almost 3 times as much as he was being offered by the New York Giants at the time. So kind of hard to sort of, turn this kind of money down. And then the hope, of course, that you come back the next year and, say, truly play ball when it came to that kind of stuff. But the owners would have nothing of it. They decided they were going to lock out these players and ban them essentially for a good 4 or 5 seasons thereafter. And this is the case that ultimately became the beginnings of the baseball labor movement. And this is just a fascinating series of stories, a wild sort of a career this guy had. And frankly, unbeknownst to many fans of the game today, an instrumental player and or player, if you will, in both senses of the word, in the evolution of how players have gained free agency in the modern day. And a lot of it centers back to a guy they called Dangerous Danny Gardella. That's the name of the book, Bob Elias' book. It's called Dangerous Danny Gardella, Baseball's Neglected Trailblazer for Today's Millionaire Athletes. It is available wherever good books are found. It is published by Rowman and Littlefield. And, of course, you can go to our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com. Search up this episode with Rob and me. And I think it's numbered 407. Yeah, you can buy a copy of this book. But sit back first and enjoy this interesting conversation. Let's learn a little bit more about Danny Gardella and the state of things that he found himself in the 1940s. And by the way, that second clip also is important, too, because that was the voice of a very famous sports columnist in the New York Times at the time. His name was Arthur Daly. And he, as you can tell, was very much on the, if you will, opposite side of this issue. He was basically a mouthpiece for the owners and the commissioner of baseball, who basically were saying, look, if you get if you get rid of this reserve clause, well, you're just going to completely upset the entire baseball apple cart. We've seen over the decades since that was entirely not the case. But you can understand sort of the division of thinking and the crossed swords, shall we say, with players like Gardella and the owners at loggerheads with each other when it came to competition and free agency. Let's get into that conversation now. It's a conversation we had about a week past. And please sit back and, as always, enjoy. How about giving our audience a little bit of background on you first? and perhaps a little bit of an adjunct into how you came about this story of Danny Gardella.
Yeah, sure. Happy to do so. So I am a emeritus professor. I taught politics and legal studies at a number of universities, but I retired from University of San Francisco a couple of years ago. I started out writing in many other areas of politics and legal studies, but I ended up later in my career moving to sports and politics, and I focused a lot on mostly on baseball. I looked a little bit at football and hockey, but mostly baseball. So this is actually my sixth baseball book, Dangerous Danny Gardella. And the way this came about, as far as specifically Gardella, is a couple of ways. I wrote an earlier book called The Empire Strikes Out, which was a history of baseball's often surprising and long-term relationship with U.S. foreign and military policy. And, baseball tried to project itself abroad along with the U.S. military projecting itself abroad in so many ways, so many interventions and occupations. And Gardella came up in one of them, which was U.S. intervention into Mexico. There were more than one of those, but one in particular. So I came across him first there, and then Peter Dreyer and I wrote two recent books, Baseball Rebels and Major League Rebels, and Gardella showed up there again, this time closer to the theme that I wanted to further develop in Dangerous Danny Gardella, and that is as someone who was a rebel because he was challenging the basically the business model, the suppressed wages that were produced by the reserve clause in his contract. So I came across him and we put some things in and we developed it a little bit, a profile of him in our two most recent books. But I felt like there was a lot more there, and the more I looked, the more fascinating it became, because it wasn't just his impact on the baseball business model, but he was just such a fascinating character. And again, the more you look, the more you realize that this guy was pretty amazing, and yet no one's ever heard of him. So aside from his contribution, I think, to the eventual free agency that ball players got, he's just a really, I think, neglected character, and so that's really how I got going on this.
Well, it's also that classic case of, if you don't see a book about some topic you're interested in, you got to write it, right?
Well, yeah, that's right. I the more I looked, I thought I can't not write this book. So, and then I was interested in the period also where this mainly developed. I've always been fascinated with the post-World War II period, and partly because I thought there was such a sort of missed potential during that time. We emerged from the war, we're on the top of the world. We have the strongest economy, and yet a number of things that we could have kept improving, I don't think really worked out that way. And, we got caught up in the anti-communist hysteria. There was a war on labor that was launched by a lot of corporations and Congress when it passed the Taft-Hartley Act. And anyway, I just became fascinated as to why we sort of missed the boat in some ways. And the labor agitation in particular, I think, was an inspiration to Gardella. He was seeing, hundreds of strikes and workers saying, this is not a fair deal. And I think it had an effect on him.
All right. Well, speaking of missing the boat, let's talk about maybe the beginnings of his story, right? Because just to get to that sort of heady influence and the whole notion of labor relations and the reserve clause and antitrust exemption and all that kind of stuff, you probably could not start out with a more, I won't say humble per se, but unwitting, I guess, or not even close to that kind of big time dynamic with this guy he was a longshoreman, right?
He was, yes, and a number of other sort of blue collar jobs. He was
before he got discovered. Yeah.
Working class guy. Yeah.
So give me some understanding of that. Like, so what is his life story? Why is he a longshoreman? And more
Right.
interestingly, how does he get quote unquote discovered as a
Yeah.
baseball potential?
Yeah. Yeah. So he was a rebel from early on, and he and his brother actually spent most of their time playing baseball, out in the sandlots. He grew up in Little Italy in the Bronx, and his brother actually was discovered first. They were both, good ball players. And then he was discovered second. He had dropped out of high school, um, so he was a high school dropout, and they were both. I mean, his brother was initially signed by the Yankees, but then he was traded immediately to the Detroit Tigers, and both of them started out with the Detroit Tigers. So he's playing for the Tigers in the minor leagues, in very obscure towns, most of them in the South, and this starts in 1938. He's traded into the Cleveland Indians organization, and then he's traded again into the Washington Senators organization. And by this time, it's 1940. He's been playing for 3 years, and he just doesn't feel like he's making the kind of progress that he wants. And also, he comes across as someone who was just kind of looking for something more. Looking for something more. And I think that might have contributed as well. He quit baseball and he went to work in a number of blue collar jobs, one of which was working in the shipbuilding industry in New York. And he was playing in an industrial league. This is a time when industrial leagues were a big deal still, so every company had a team, and he was spotted. He was spotted by a New York Giants scout, and the guy was just very impressed. And he said, how come you're not playing professional baseball? And he reported this to Mel Ott, who was the player manager of the Giants. Ott came to see him. And Gardella had a great game, and so he was signed to basically their Triple A, their highest minor league team in Jersey City. Now he hadn't gotten higher than really A ball when he was in the minors before that, and now he's in Triple A, one step away from the New York Giants. So that's the early sort of part of the story. That's how he gets.
Let me go back for a second, because that's really
Yeah,
interesting. I mean, here's a guy who, without it, not even finishing high school, he's obviously got some kind of talent in to be attractive to the major league teams and their minor league organizations. And this is a guy you're saying effectively walked away from the game in 1940. This before the U.S. getting involved in World War II, a year beforehand.
that's right.
And so he just winds his way back to the New York metro area and starts working in a shipyard because he's got nothing else really kind of going on. And he's playing pro ball or semi-pro ball on the side. Is that pretty much the deal?
Yes, yes, that's exactly it. And
he can't,
again,
and he's also not able to kind of join the armed services, I guess, right? Because of he had a punctured eardrum or something, I think, from my
yes,
memory.
yes,
So
that's right.
was he even interested in military service, or was that just lucky for him?
I think he would have done it. I believe he had to go for the physical, and he failed it. So I guess if he had passed it, he would have gone in. Um, yeah, there's no evidence that he was trying to avoid it, but they wouldn't take him. So that's how he ended up not in the military during that period of time during the war.
So what year then is he effectively discovered by this scout?
It's not until 1944. So
okay, so then we're talking about a 4-year period, by the way, in which the U.S. gets dragged into and then doubles down into this World War effort on 2 different theaters, right?
yeah,
How does a guy like this, who was barely making it in the minors, work a day job, plays ball on the side, and then literally gets to the AAA level 4 years later? I mean, was it natural talent that was only kind of just starting to show itself, or a dumb luck, or what?
I don't know exactly, but my guess is that he he was putting a lot of pressure on himself in the minor leagues in this period between 1938 and 1940, and maybe that acted to his detriment. I mean, he had some good years, but he just wasn't getting the kind of attention that would have promoted him to a higher level. And maybe being in an industrial league was more casual. He didn't put pressure on himself, and he was always he was a small guy, even by the standards of the time. 5'7", I think 150 pounds, but he was immensely strong, immensely strong. So he was hitting these unbelievable home runs, especially for someone his size. And that began to flourish again while he was in the industrial league. And I think that's part of what, attracted attention.
Was he looking to get another shot, another cup of coffee, or is this sort of happenstance? What is the scenario? How does Ott discover Gardella?
That's a good question, because there's some evidence that he had actually gotten an invitation from the Washington Senators, I think it was. Now I'm blanking on this, and he just sort of opened the letter and looked at it and sort of filed it away and didn't really follow up, and so you're thinking, well, he just had no confidence that this would work out. But anyway, he did put it aside, and then I think he was assuming he wasn't going to play. But the person who spotted him was a guy named Joe Birmingham, and Birmingham was coaching baseball teams in the Industrial League, the Shipyard Industrial League. But Birmingham was a player for the Cleveland Indians, and he also managed the team for a while. So he was very immersed himself as a player and a manager before he got out of that and just became a scout. And Birmingham was apparently very convincing. I'm not sure that Danny thought it was going to be a good idea, but Birmingham thought he really had a lot of potential, and he presented a very strong case to Mel Ott about his talent.
So he's playing, before he gets to the New York version of the Giants, he's playing in Jersey City over there at the old Roosevelt Stadium, right?
Yes.
So how long was he there, and how does he distinguish himself so quickly to catch the eye of the big team?
Yeah, so one of the first things he distinguishes himself is that he's obviously got a lot of idiosyncrasies, and we can talk a little bit about the character he was, the kinds of unusual things that he did. But the main thing is that he was just hitting up a storm, just immediately became a sensation on the field. And so he immediately then attracted attention, and he was brought up. So, you would think, well, you're going to spend some time in AAA, spend some time in Jersey City, but no, he was brought up very quickly, and he made a big splash on the Giants when he got up there. He didn't spend the whole season up there. He sort of tailed off a little bit at the end of 1944, and went back to Jersey City for like the last month. But then in 1945, he started there again, and he was immediately a sensation, and he was brought up again in 1945 to the Giants.
And what are some of these idiosyncrasies, and how are they manifesting themselves? Because you get a sense from your writing and some of his early pictures and stuff that I'm curious as to like how he becomes such a showboat, given especially how challenging his early career was, and maybe wanting to stay up in the major leagues.
Yeah. Well, he was just an incredibly free spirit, and it turns out that he was really quite talented in a lot of ways. So he was an acrobat and a gymnast. He was a weight training pioneer when everyone in baseball said that weight training was a really bad idea. He was a Golden Glove boxer. He was self-taught, so he was a poet, and he learned philosophy and psychology, and he would be quoting Shakespeare and Edgar Allan Poe. He would do these acrobatic stunts that no one could believe, because he was so incredibly strong. he was a singer, a very talented singer. He sang opera. He sang. Eventually, had a career, a short career as a Broadway singer. He sang on vaudeville. So these are not. I mean, I can go on. He was a vegetarian. He hypnotized his fellow ball players when no one thought. Everyone thought that was crazy to try to improve their performance. Now players do get hypnotized to do that thing. So he just sort of stood out as, wow, this guy's really different. So so he made an impression in terms of, again, his idiosyncrasies. But the main thing, of course, was that he was hitting the ball all over the place. I mean, fairly soon in the 45 season, he was batting cleanup and replacing Ott himself in the outfield and Joe Medwick, another Hall of Famer, in the outfield. So he just had this meteoric rise and was just this very unusual character.
So what do you think was his biggest appeal? Was it the antics? Was it the weightlifting and his strength? Was it his prowess, certainly at the plate? I mean, he had a fairly solid hitting career for his at least those 2 years. It's clear he was no minor leaguer. He was there. Yeah. He was clearly qualified to play. What do you think it was that kind of made him such a such a cog in that team?
Yeah. Well, it was a mixed picture, right? Because on the one hand, he was fun to be around. Everyone liked being, having him around. And when he left, his fellow ball players were upset because he seemed to be the life of the party in the clubhouse. He was very popular with the fans. This is another thing I think that's important. He was putting a lot of people in the seats for the Giants at that time. They started a Gardella garden in the bleachers. There was a Danny Gardella fan club. I mean, normally you'd have to wait around for a while to get your own fan club. And also, the Polo Grounds up to that point did not have people coming to the park with banners supporting one player or another. He was the first one, apparently, for that to happen. So there was this sense that this guy was a very, very popular with the fans, which, of course, the Giants were interested in having. And then, of course, what he did on the field. And particularly his hitting. He was criticized for some of his fielding, although I think unfairly and by the sports writers in some cases. But it was really the hitting that really stood out. He became a valuable player, and the Giants were winning games. So it's pretty much all you could ask for, really. I know Mel Ott got upset about some of the things because he just couldn't believe, some of the antics he pulled. But it was hard to ignore the contribution he was making to the team on the field.
Can you describe some of the stunts and or antics in particular?
Well, he would do a lot of acrobatic stuff. So at the end of an inning, he'd be out in the outfield and he'd do some kind of stunt for the fans on the way in. And then he would do things, sort of between games or between innings. So he would do a handstand on the dugout. And then there were all these incidents outside of the field where he would be, pulling pranks or just sort of doing one unusual thing after another. There was at the time a fairly famous incident where he had a roommate, Nap Reyes was his name, and they were in a hotel, and it's a subject of debate as to how high in the hotel they were, but somewhere around the 25th floor of the hotel. And Danny decided it would be fun if he left a note for his roommate, saying that he had lost his interest in life and he was going to chuck it all. And so he opened the window and he lowered himself down out the window and hung on to the windowsill with the open window and left the note for Nap when he got out of the bathroom. So Nap comes out and he looks at the note and he's completely crazy. He looks at the window is open, and he goes over to it, and Danny's hanging from the 25th floor by his fingertips. And he could do that because he was just so incredibly strong. So it was just one crazy thing like that after another.
Let's also put this in perspective too. He's playing for the Giants, the New York version thereof, in 1944 and 1945, right? Which is a time that was challenging the country on a whole bunch of different levels, and including sports, and
Yes.
baseball in particular. A lot of players were actively volunteering and or serving otherwise, drafting into service. So there were a lot of quality players that were abroad. Some were still continuing to keep their baseball chops, as we've explored in some other episodes, and some of the sort of military leagues, if you will, that were sort of out there around the world to keep them, I guess,
Right.
kind of fresh or a little away, maybe perhaps away from the front lines. Did that have anything to do with his sudden rise to the majors, that dearth of player pool, and or did maybe that hasten his or sharpen his appeal to the club and to the fans, versus, say, maybe, I don't know, a stronger player pool by which he would
Yeah.
be competing?
Yeah. 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 No, it's a good question. And I look at that in the book. And yeah, sure. I think there's certainly a certain degree of that the pool was weaker. And so it gave players that might not have made it a better chance. But on the other hand, I think, first of all, we need to keep in mind that a lot of players did stay, or they were only away for a year or two. That, there's sort of a debate as to what the level of dilution of the league actually occurred. It certainly did occur, but I'm not sure it was as weak as some people described it. But the big point, I think, is that he really did establish himself. He didn't just play and he was just sort of serviceable. He really became pretty much of a star at the time. So I think that argues for him having a status that, sure, when all the players come back who've been away, he's going to have more competition, and maybe he's going to be on the bench more. But I don't think he's just going to be someone who's thrown off the team because all the other guys are back. But yeah, it's I think it was certainly at least a part of the reason why he was able to get to where he was.
Okay, well, that obviously sets the tone for what happens next, right? So the war ends, and in 1946, there's a whole influx of players, either former players or people who wanted to pursue but had their career interrupted or their pursuits interrupted, regardless, coming back from military service, right? So, quote unquote, happy days are here again. Where does Gardella sit in the offseason between 45 and 46 with the Giants organization? It's pretty clear they want him back, but they're not necessarily, I don't know, treating him like the star player, perhaps, that he might have started to become in those 2
Right.
years.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. So again, I think it's important to know that there were a number of players who had already come back. They didn't all come back. All the ones who left came back at the same time. There were more. So there was going to be definitely some competition. So the Giants are thinking, well, we don't have to be too generous here. I mean, I think this was their thinking. We don't have to be too generous here because, if he objects to what we're offering him for his next contract, then, we probably have some other guys who could fit the bill. So what happened is that he was sent his contract along with everyone else who was on the roster, and he got a raise of $500, and he thought that was insulting, that he deserved a lot more given what contribution he had made to the team. And then during spring training, he either missed the train going down to spring training. The Giants were training in Miami that year. And this is a suspicion he voiced, or he was purposely given incorrect information. And why would they do that? Well, at the end of the 1945 year, he got into a couple of clashes with Mel Ott. And although he had made a contribution on the field, Ott was, I think, getting a little bit tired of some of the antics. And So I would think they were maybe factoring that in terms of what how much to signal that he was a really valuable component by virtue of the kind of raise that they offered. So he makes his way down to spring training in Miami, and he has not signed his contract because he wants a bigger contract. And the Giants really start playing hardball, really quickly. And there was also an incident in the team hotel where the managing secretary of the team got into a clash with Gardella over something that seemed so trivial, but that Gardella didn't have the proper clothes on for the dining room. I guess that all the other players had a jacket and tie on. Gardella claimed he didn't know that was a rule, but he just arrived, off the train, which he had to pay for, and he was going in trying to get some reimbursement for the expense. He got into this big clash, and that didn't help. So he was actually banned from the hotel, banned from the team hotel, and also initially from the spring training field. Ott relented to allow him to suit up, but he actually didn't really do any practicing. If you have the book, the photo that's on the cover of the book was actually taken at spring training in Miami, where he did this stunt on the bat, but he actually was almost immediately after that told that he had to give back his uniform and that he better sign the contract or otherwise he was going to be sold. And so a clash begins as a result of that.
All right, what's this? Ah, yes, the old Fort Wayne Baseball Company. Fort Wayne, Indiana. Hello. Well, I tell you, one of the great pleasures of doing this show is not only delving into the histories of professional teams that don't exist anymore, but also interacting with fans and finding and discovering new companies. Not even new companies, old companies too, like the old Fort Wayne Baseball Company, for that matter, who just share our love for these forgotten teams and leagues and the stories behind them, for goodness sakes. And at Old Fort Wayne Baseball Company, you're going to find great shirts and hats and sweatshirts and stickers and posters and prints and mugs, you name it, supporting and remembering some great franchises in forgotten sports history. For example, the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League, Fort Wayne Daisies, an iconic franchise in that iconic league. If you remember the late 70s and early 80s when professional slow pitch softball was a thing, how about the Fort Wayne Scouts and the then renamed Fort Wayne Huggy Bears? Commemorated in T-shirt and all kinds of other forms. The Fort Wayne Colored Giants, one of the oft-forgotten Negro League teams of the early years. All kinds of great stuff, and then some. Hey, you're going to find stuff like the old Fort Wayne Flames of the American Indoor Soccer Association. Who could forget them? And how about the Fort Wayne Fury of the CBA? Yes, the Continental Basketball Association. All that and much, much more at the Old Fort Wayne Baseball Co. And you can check them out. It's oldfortbaseballco.com. Again, oldfortbaseballco.com, and use a promo code. Of course, we want to save you some bucks. Right there in the 260, yeah, that's the area code there. The promo code there is Good Seats, all one word, Good Seats, for 15% off all of your purchases at the Old Fort Wayne Baseball Company, and that's oldfortbaseballco.com, and the promo code Good Seats for 15% off. Our thanks to Logan Weaning and his friends at the Old Fort Wayne Baseball Company for their sponsorship of this here little show. And now back to our conversation. So that's interesting. That free spirit, in some respect, is maybe getting a little in the way here, right? I mean, maybe he was overly confident that he was going to be able to kind of go in there and renegotiate his contract, maybe misreading the room, so to speak. Or perhaps it's also a case of Major League Baseball team, right? Basically saying, well, take it or leave it. Where else are you going to go?
Exactly. Yeah, that was the dilemma. I don't think he was overly confident. He just thought that $500 just didn't measure what he had contributed to the team. And he didn't really have a figure in mind, but it just came across to him as insulting. I don't think he was really confident. No, I don't really think so. He just wasn't satisfied.
All right. Well, tell me then this alternative that he discovers or knows about, and maybe put
Right.
it in a framework about what this Mexican League scenario was all about in the first place anyway, like a little bit of background as to what it is or was at the time,
Right.
and how viable an option was it, or was this a relatively newly viable thinking, given that there was this surplus of players and arguably some other players, perhaps like Gardella, were trying to keep their eyes open for possibly other opportunities should their contracts not be renegotiated or taken up.
Right. Right. So you have to go back to the contract that all the ball players had to sign, the uniform contract, which all included this reserve clause. And briefly, the reserve clause meant that if you sign with the team, that you basically become property of the team, which means you play for that team that season, and then you're reserved for the following season, except if the team decides that they don't want you, in which case, at least originally, they could cut you in 10 days and cancel the contract. So the problem is that the teams are collaborating with each other. They're colluding with each other because every team has the same contract that they've all agreed to with the reserve clause, which means that they've set up a system where a player can't say, well, I'm not really happy with the offer you're making, so I'm going to check out some other team. So it prevented, in other words, players from trying to get their services bought by the highest bidder among the teams. So what this does is it suppresses wages, and it also also tends to enhance profits, right? So it's a part of the business model. So that's why the players were having a hard time in getting what they thought they deserve as far as their pay was concerned. So the only way in which they could get around this would be occasionally if there was another major league available to actually play for. And this did happen a few times. In 1882, an American association competed with the National League. In 1890, the Players League came about and competed with the National League. And then in the early 1900s, when the American League emerged, and then the American League challenged the National League, so that was a time when there was a little bit of leeway. And then the last time was in 1914, when the National League and American League were challenged by the Federal League. So each time this happened, the players could jump to a new league, but in every one of these cases, it was very short-lived. So it meant there was only a year or two when they would be free from the reserve clause and able to make a higher salary than they would have made if they had stayed in the existing league. So this is why the Mexican League becomes of possible importance here. And that is that if this is another major league, and if you can get a lot more pay working in this league than you can in the National League or the American League, then that's a real challenge to the Major League Baseball business model. And so the way this came about is Gardella worked. Among his many jobs, he worked as a trainer and a masseuse at a gym called Al Roon's Gym. And Al Roon's Gym was a sort of high level, high class gym in New York City. He had several branches for it. And one of the people who came to work out there was a guy named Jorge Pascal. And Pascal was assigned to Danny Gardella, and they became friendly. And actually, Pascal knew about Gardella because he was a big baseball fan, so he followed U.S. baseball. But he was a Mexican, and he was a multimillionaire, and he owned a team in the Mexican League, the Veracruz Blues, and basically was running the league. And he had been improving the league for several years prior to this. And part of what he was doing is he was plucking Negro League players from the U.S., right, who still were not able to play in the U.S. major leagues. And he was building up some very strong talent there, along with the talent that he also took from other places in the Caribbean, Cuba and Mexico and elsewhere. And anyway, he was flabbergasted that Gardella was making so little. And this was even before the contract came along with such a small, increase in pay. And he said to Gardella, look, you could come and play for my team. I'll pay you a lot more than that. And apparently Pascal had in mind that the next step for him was going to go beyond the Negro League players, beyond the black players, and to start to try to raid players from the white players from the U.S. major leagues. So when Gardella began having this clash then with the Giants, he remembered this, even though he turned it down at the time. He said, "Oh, that's silly. I'm a Giant. I want to play for the New York Giants." But he got into this clash, and then he remembered this. And so as things got worse and worse, he finally did contact Pascal, and he said, "Yeah, come aboard and bring whoever else you can, and I'm going to pay them a lot of money in order to do this." So that's sort of the short story.
Well, all right, give me a little bit more on Pascal, because that sounds this sounds like it's almost a trying to almost create a level challenger, if you will, albeit in outside the United States, to Major League Baseball, and
Yes.
and with cunning, right, and a recognition, right, that there's this gigantic pool of players that are literally and figuratively segregated into this Negro Leagues thing, who are
Yes.
either as talented or in many cases more talented than some of the white players playing in quote unquote organized baseball.
Yes.
It's interesting, it's ironic, and it's also somewhat ingenious, right? Where he's sort of recognizing that there are flaws in the U.S. baseball system that could be taken advantage of.
That's right. And not only the black players, but also except for the occasional stars, all of the white players are also being taken advantage of because their pay is being suppressed by the reserve clause and also baseball's exemption from the antitrust laws. And so, yeah, sure, he's got a lot of money, and he's determined that he's going to build up this league, and he's sort of playing off some historic resentments, really. He comes across as a figure that's almost a representation of the pushback that Mexico could do for against the U.S. for all of the things that the U.S. did to Mexico over the years, from the Mexican War to Mexican interventions. One of the interventions was in Veracruz, which was his hometown, and he and his cousin are cowering in a basement to try to avoid being killed. A number of people he knew were killed there. So in a sense, he's a kind of pushing back against the big neighbor to the north. But he was very skilled and he was very talented in organizing, and he had a lot of money to spend. So and he was willing to do it. And I guess the final thing is that he just resented the idea that you would have a World Series, but there would be no country outside the U.S. involved in the World Series. How can that be the World Series? You should play the champion of the Mexican League if you want to be a world champion.
Yeah, just wait until the 2020s when we have a World Baseball Classic. If you can hold on for a dozen more, a couple dozen more years. Right, but all right. So he plays then in Mexico, does pretty well, apparently. And what was 46 kind of the season of the jumper, so to speak, or was that just his year?
That was where it started, and Gardella did lure a number of the players that eventually jumped. There were about 25 of them who jumped.
So he was almost, and I want to call him a ringleader, but he was kind of he was almost a mentor, an exemplar, somebody who, hey, if Danny's doing it, maybe I could do it too.
Yes, absolutely. And the team that lost the most players was the Giants. So through a combination of seeing his example on the one hand and him attempting to lure some players in particular on the other hand, and then of course Pascal starting to dangle the money. Now, there were some big stars also who were approached, and some of them came pretty close. Apparently, Stan Musial came quite close. Phil Rizzuto came quite close, but he offered big salaries to people like Ted Williams and Bob Feller, and so he was serious. And then so the money is there, and then Gardella's reporting at, hey, this is you're going to have a much better situation here. You're going to get a lot more money in 1 year than you make in 5 years staying with the Giants or some other MLB team.
So he made the All-Star game that year and all that. So why did he not stay longer if it was such a good deal? Was it only a short-term contract? And why did he decide to come back? And tell us why it was so short-lived, I guess.
Yeah, well, it didn't work out as well as Pascal had hoped for. Although there were a number of the players who did stay longer than just 1 year. For Danny, part of it was that he had left his girlfriend behind, and it is true that they at one point she finally came down to Mexico City and they got married, but she was leaving what was the beginnings of her career up in New York, and they also wanted to start a family, and so there was kind of this lure back partly, and then not as much incentive to stay because the league wasn't doing as well as Pascal thought it would. He was hoping to attract more players, to create more excitement and more fans. They did pretty well, but it just didn't have that excitement by the start of the second year that it had before, and so I think it was just a combination of those ingredients. And I think that Gardella thought, well, I maybe although he was banned along with the other jumpers, that maybe that would be overturned, and maybe he could get back to playing baseball anyway. But it wasn't really the main factor. It was just a sense that I think I need to go home.
And what did he think he would be able to go home to when it came to baseball, if anything?
Yeah, I think he wasn't sure. I mean, he'd already been banned. The commissioner had issued a 5-year ban for anyone who jumped. So that was designed to punish the people who had jumped. And
I'm sorry, that ban, Happy Chandler at the time, the commissioner, that ban was in place before he decided to jump. So he knew that he would be, quote unquote, violating that
no,
issuance. Okay.
No. It was after they jumped. Yeah. It was, some people had jumped already. There were others who jumped in addition. But what Chandler was doing is he was trying to prevent more people from jumping, and then he was trying to punish the people who did jump. It's 5 years for a baseball player. That's a long time. So if you came back after 5 years, your skills would probably have deteriorated, and maybe no one would want you on the team. So it was a big deal. Yeah, so I don't think Gardella was necessarily thinking he was going to play baseball. He could go back to a number of the jobs he had previously. Go back to Al Rune's. He could go back into the shipyards. He worked for the New Yorker Hotel. He did lots of things, and so I think he was just going to wait and see as far as baseball.
Okay, so how does he become the name behind this court case challenging the Chandler ban / edict? Is he recruited for that too?
No. So what happens is that he does get back in the game, and he's playing semi-pro baseball in Staten Island. And so that's close by to the Bronx, and then they eventually moved to Yonkers. So he's playing ball in Staten Island. He's not making very much money, but he's making some money. It's making a contribution, and he's having a good season. And then at a certain point, Chandler starts saying, anyone who is playing against or with Gardella or any of the other jumpers is going to be potentially banned from professional baseball, from Major League Baseball, and on the minor league level as well as on the major league level. So now you have this whole new situation where it's not clear that players are going to be willing to play with him or against him. And I think especially for players against him, and he begins to encounter this in some of the teams that they're playing on Staten Island, where players are not in the lineup because they're prospects for a major league team, and they don't want to ruin their chances. So this all comes to head in a
So
game.
Gardella's presence on a team is a potential infection point, if you will, for other
Exactly.
players that might play. That's mafioso almost.
Yes, it is. It is. And also it's just a foolish, stupid thing to do, really. It's just like shooting yourself in the foot. And I think some of the team owners began to question Chandler on this. Like, hey, doesn't look like this league is going to be that big a challenge. You should lighten up a little bit here. But Chandler just, no, I can't do that. I'm just gonna stick to it. So yeah. So well, this comes to a head then in a game near the end of the season where the this team played, of course, in a league. His Staten Island team. He played in a league. He played for the Gulf Oilers. That was the team's name. But they also played a number of games outside the league, and they would play other semi-pro teams, and sometimes play professional teams. And one of the teams that they were scheduled to play was the Cleveland Buckeyes, and the Cleveland Buckeyes had just won the American division of the Negro Leagues. And they were playing games just as a kind of tune-up for the Negro League World Series. So they come to Staten Island, and Chandler contacts the ballpark, the Gulf Oilers ballpark, and says, "I need you to make an announcement over the public address system that anyone who plays with or against one of the jumpers, including Danny Gardella, it may be in jeopardy for being able to play professional, play Major League Baseball." So this is a team of black players soon after Jackie Robinson breaks the color barrier, and some of them are thinking, well, wait, maybe I could be, the next one. So they were, a little bit skittish about this, about, well, this could be a real risk. We maybe need to take this take this seriously. And so they pull out of the game. And Gardella says, no, don't do that. I'm not gonna play. I'm not gonna ruin this game. But it really pisses him off because he's publicly embarrassed by this incident. And then what happens is there's a fan in the stands, and he's observing this, and he finds out more about it, and he's just outraged. He happens to be a dentist, and a New York City dentist. And I guess a few days later, he has a patient, a guy named Frederick Johnson, and he's telling him about what he observed in this game and how outrageous it was that Gardella was treated this way. Well, it turns out that Fred Johnson was an attorney, and also an attorney who had done a lot of writing and even some legal work having to do with the reserve clause and antitrust exemption. So Johnson says, well, I guess I think I want to be in contact with this guy. And so it emerges from there. Then it becomes a legal issue.
How does the publicity around this start to I'm assuming it's part of the strategy, right? Getting this case sort of in play and stuff. And the odds are kind of long, right? At least in the beginning, for him to even. So I guess a little bit of sort of understanding about sort of the dynamics around the case, the public perception of it, its potential storylines through baseball, and the relative confidence or fear of those in Major League Baseball because of this case.
Right. Well, I think in a certain way, although you can't say it was really, closely coordinated, but it certainly came across as a real kind of propaganda effort. The owners, of course, were outraged, and they started to accuse him of challenging baseball in a way that would destroy baseball. Started making their arguments about how they had to have the antitrust exemption, they had to have the reserve clause, otherwise everything would fall apart. And they got politicians involved, and also the sports writers. Overwhelmingly, the sports writers were against Gardella, and they were really almost entirely singing the tune of the owners. And it was brutal, really. If you just follow these, newspaper articles, it was just really, really brutal about, this guy's a communist and he's trying to destroy what, is, what one person is saying, that this will be the death knell for the sport that has kindled the fires of ambition in thousands of young Americans. So between the sports writers and the politicians and the owners, it's pretty much of this guy is a nut and he needs to stop this silliness. But Johnson was very very dedicated to this, and Gardella remained fast on this. The other thing that was troubling is that the players were surveyed, the existing players. And they'd all been convinced that the reserve clause, oh yeah, that was absolutely necessary. The level of sort of unconsciousness about how they were being exploited was truly amazing. And I know that later Marvin Miller, who became the head of the baseball union, when he started out, he said he was astounded as to how little consciousness the ball players had of the value they were creating and how little they were being paid for that value. So Gardella then had the ball players against him as well. Like, oh, he's just he's being a troublemaker, and he needs to stop because he's going to mess things up. And then the worst is that a number of the jumpers began to take the side of the owners.
Yeah, that was my major question. Is like I'm surprised that this wasn't somehow had become a class action suit, but it is. Keep going. I'm surprised at this.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, Mickey Owen was one of the jumpers, and he was more or less the ringleader for this, and he. Basically, Commissioner Chandler said, well, if you want to do something about this, and you better get the jumpers to, get on board here to block this suit. And Owen claimed that he went around the country to talk about the jumpers who had come back. And then a couple of them met with Gardella to try to convince him otherwise, met with him a couple of times, actually. What Owen's motivation was, if I can convince him to drop this thing, then the Dodgers are going to reinstate me, and I'm going to be able to get back in the majors again. And that it was really Gardella, not Chandler, who was preventing the jumpers from getting back in. That if it wasn't for Gardella, then maybe the commissioner would rescind the ban, earlier than the 5 years.
Wow. So a lot of intrigue and subterfuge going on there. So let me take us. We have people to buy the book, of course, to get more specifics here, but a little bit of a thumbnail of sort of the history of this case, because you've described clearly this was almost a solo effort on his part and required a certain amount of not only conviction but intestinal fortitude, I guess, from all these other sort of brick throwers, so to speak. It wasn't a straight path to what ultimately, it wasn't a victory. Well, tell us how it kind of tortuously got through to the layers it did it
was torture. Yeah. And partly because it took so long. The key case that eventually emerged didn't happen until 1949. I guess the short story is that initially his case was taken by a judge who studied the case when was about to make a ruling on the case, and he died. So then it had to be turned over to another judge, and who had to start all over again. And so that delayed things. Eventually, that judge made a decision, and he didn't make a decision on the merits of Gardella's claim. And Gardella's claim was that two things. First of all, that the contract was illegitimate because it was there wasn't equity in the contract. It was so incredibly one-sided that it shouldn't stand. But the judge focused on the antitrust aspect of it, which was the second part of the argument that Johnson was making on Gardella's behalf. And that is that the Supreme Court had decided in 1922, this is the famous case that was the decision that was issued by Oliver Wendell Holmes, that that's a sort of complicated, but the bottom line was that it was giving Major League Baseball an exemption from antitrust, which meant that the things that antitrust would otherwise prevent, like collusion among companies, was allowed, and a lot of other things, actually. And Johnson was arguing that they shouldn't have this exemption anymore, that they never deserved it in the first place. But the judge in this case refused to unilaterally overturn the Supreme Court's decision. They said, if it goes to the Supreme Court, and it's not going to go through me, but if it goes to the Supreme Court, then and they change their mind, then if a case comes back to me, then I would decide accordingly. So the only way it would get to the Supreme Court is if it was appealed, and so that's what they did. So they appealed the case from the rejection that Gardella got, and eventually, again, more time goes by. Eventually, it went to the Second Circuit Appeals Court, Federal Appeals Court, and the owners were confident, that it would be upheld. This court is just going to continue to support the precedent that was made in 1922, and they were shocked to discover that the court did not do that. It was a three-judge court, a three-judge federal court. One judge decided in favor of the owners, but the two others did not, and they didn't do so lightly. They did so very in a very outraged way. And the thing that was very important about this decision was who it came from. These were two of the most illustrious federal court judges in American history, a guy named Jerome Frank on the one hand and Leonard Hand on the other hand.
Sure,
and Frank
sure.
Frank was particularly outraged of what, this was involuntary servitude here in violation of the 13th Amendment. And he went on and on about this. So the owners were shocked. So unfortunately, that didn't end the case, right? Because they needed to send it back to a trial court to say that no, this is still a live case, and you need to redo this case. So this sent the major league owners into a panic, and they were trying to figure out what to do about this, and they started talking about settlements, and so. Then it proceeded from there. But that's the basic legal trajectory up to that point.
And how did it kind of end then? I mean, was it more Chandler and Major League Baseball kind of making motions to offer things like amnesty and perhaps settle on Gardella's claims? I guess he was seeking a couple $100,000 in damages, or was it more Gardella and his lawyer? And I don't know how he was funding his lawyer, by the way. I don't know if it was pro bono or what. I have to think there had to been some hefty legal costs that were piling up too now, especially at the length of this, as well as two different jurisdictions, if you will, and now maybe looking now at a third situation, right? There's not a bottomless pit of money there, probably. So was it more Gardella, or was it more Major League Baseball, or how does the sort of end of this part of the story happen?
So Chandler kind of gets cold feet here, and he's kind of thrown by this, and he turns a lot of this over to one of the owners, the Cardinals owner at the time, Fred Say was his name, and so Say gets involved quite a bit in trying to convince Johnson to settle on Gardella's behalf, and Johnson sort of, pushes this off a couple of times apparently, and then Chandler decides that he is going to rescind the ban, and he's going to allow the jumpers to come back early. So this would be in the third year rather than in the fifth year. So some of the players do come back, and they're reinstated. Now, by this time, Gardella is playing in the Quebec Provincial League up in Canada, and by the way, having a fabulous season, and pretty much along with Sal Magli, another future star, basically brings the championship to the Drummondville team that they were playing on in Canada. So he's doing really well, but he decides that he's not going to drop the case, even though he is eligible then to be signed by. Actually, he would have been eligible to be signed by the Giants. So that could have been a factor as well.
Right, exactly. The fundamental issue still hasn't been solved. He's still an indentured servant to his team. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, to make a long story short, is basically a concrete offer was made that Gardella tried to refuse, but ultimately he felt like he couldn't refuse it because, several years had passed now. He had little or no money, had little or no resources. He needed to have some money, and he was convinced that even if he was restored, he was going to be blacklisted again because everyone hated him. And it appears that that's exactly what happened. So he did, in fact, get take a settlement. He was restored, and he was allowed to be signed by the St. Louis Cardinals. But although he did well in spring training that year, 1950, and he was on the team in opening day roster, he got one at bat as a pinch hitter a couple of weeks later, and they sent him down not just to AAA, they sent him down to AA in Houston. And anyway, things just sort of devolved from that, and ultimately he was dropped from that team, and mysteriously no other team was interested in him, and so there was no one to sign him, and so that was the end of his career. But he did get a settlement. He got a settlement of $60,000. But he had to split that in half. He owed Johnson $30,000 and another attorney $1,000. So he ended up with $29,000 as a result of this, which, $29,000 was worth more back then, but it still wasn't, some luxury breakthrough for him. So he has to use that, wisely, let's say, going forward.
All right, a couple of questions, and we can cul-de-sac it then with sort of what then on a grander scale sort of happens in the wake of all this years later, and the true importance that you're surfacing now of this story.
Uh-huh.
I guess two quickies. Number one, I'm curious as to, did the other jumpers that now were benefiting from a rescinded ban, why would they not have looked at Gardella anew as maybe being a good thing for them because they're now able to play baseball a few years sooner than they ordinarily would have? Like, why would they still be hostile to him, so to speak?
Yes, that's true. They should have been much more grateful to him. I don't think they were completely hostile, but they certainly didn't seem grateful. And I think there's an even bigger question here, and that is because what Gardella did was very much a part of instigating another attempt to unionize the workers, the creation of the American Baseball Guild, led by a guy named Robert Murphy. And Gardella's suit and the emergence of that as a new challenge to the owners did cause the owners to make some concessions as far as salaries were concerned. And even the jump itself caused the owners to bump up some salaries where they thought, well, we can keep these other guys from jumping if we just bump up their salaries a lot. and there seemed to be no acknowledgement of that, no gratefulness at all of that among the players. So yes, it must have been very very depleting to have experienced that by Gardella.
And the second little question there is, how and why does Gardella actually get traded and or accepted by another team and invited to try out and play in spring training and actually get another major league at bat, and then to be summarily dismissed afterwards? I mean, why even go through any of that stuff? I mean, that sounds like a gray ball, not a black ball.
Yeah, well, they certainly weren't going to, they weren't going to announce it, but they wanted to give the appearance at least that he was going to get the same opportunity to get back into the majors as the other jumpers. And he was signed in particular by the Cardinals because it was Fred Say, the owner, who had arranged for the settlement in the first place. So basically, Say is saying, well, we'll take him. We'll handle that. And then made all sorts of promises that, oh yeah, we have no hard feelings, and we're going to give him every shot, and all of the rest. But I think Gardella's suspicion was real, and then it seemed like that's what happened again, because it was awfully abrupt that he was dropped from it.
All right, so that was 1950, right? He lived a hearty life thereafter until March of 2005. So he died at the age of, was it 85, right?
Yes.
What does he do in the intervening those years afterwards? I suspect nothing in and around baseball was either available to him or maybe even of interest, like even at a high school or other than pro baseball kind of realm. And maybe a little bit of what was his what were you able to determine his I don't know, his feelings were towards the game and or how his life circumstance played out and that kind of stuff? And did he ever in his lifetime get any kind of recognition for the beginnings of what ultimately was a successful effort by the late 1970s, early 80s to get things righted, frankly, that he and his lawyers saw early on?
Yeah. So he worked a number of blue collar jobs after baseball. He did a little bit of baseball, with amateur teams, and tried to keep his hand in it on a certain level. He would go to card shows and some baseball events, but he really wasn't, sort of welcomed with, real open arms. But he was a singer. He was a very talented singer. So he had dipped him into this previously, while he was waiting for his court decision. But now he had the opportunity to try to pursue this pretty much full time. And he did, he was a Broadway singer in a number of clubs, and then he did this in Canada. He did it in New England, upstate New York, and then he also was on the vaudeville circuit for a while as well. But although he really was regarded as being talented. It just didn't pan out. It didn't work out. He didn't have resources. He didn't really have a decent manager to do this. At one point, he thought he would try an opera career because he was, again, just fabulous as an opera singer, and that didn't work out either. So he really fell back on these other blue collar jobs. He could go back and work at Al Roon's. He worked upstate, doing a number of jobs at the big hotels, and he ended up working for what became AT&T for a number of years over in Queens. So it was really a sort of back to a working class lifestyle, and pretty much just getting by. As far as the legacy, what happened is that there were a number of cases that came afterwards throughout the 50s and the 1960s where in every single case, the Gardella precedent was cited, and it had to do with to start with a lot of minor leaguers who were complaining about the reserve clause and the antitrust exemption. And in each time they did this, they were basically bought off. The same thing that happened to Gardella. But it also provoked a couple of congressional investigations. When it was cited as to why they were investigating baseball, the Gardella case was brought up as something that needed to be resolved. The Congress and the Supreme Court kept sort of throwing back and forth this issue of the antitrust exemption, and neither one of them were really willing to do anything to reconsider in any serious way the 1922 exemption decision. But as this went forward, people began talking about the Gardella effect, and what they were doing is referring to the Gardella versus Chandler precedent, right, which is the only federal court decision that had decided that baseball was violating the law in a couple of different ways by virtue of violating the antitrust laws in the first place, and then the unequal contract, violating contract law as well. But not only that, it's not just in baseball, but cases were filed for similar grounds, for similar issues in the National Football League, the National Hockey League, the horse racing industry, and even the dog show industry. You have all these cases where Gardella versus Chandler is a part of the legal arguments. So what this does is it builds up to a point that we finally get to the story that I think people are more familiar with, and that's the Curt Flood story. So, Marvin Miller by this time has become the head of the baseball union. It starts actually acting like a real union on behalf of the players, and Curt Flood is told that he's going to be traded to the Philadelphia Phillies after having a long career with the St. Louis Cardinals, and he says no. And so he's going to file a case, and it's going to be on the same kind of grounds that Gardella filed his case. And he specifically uses the Gardella precedent in his legal arguments, and especially the part where Jerome Frank is basically condemning the whole business model. And so we know the Curt Flood story. A lot of people know the Curt Flood story, and that although he lost his case also before the Supreme Court, it really raised the consciousness of the ball players. And then the ball players then were on board for what Miller wanted to do, and that is to launch a challenge by other means. And that's where we get, in 1975, there's an arbitration decision that has to do with Andy Messerschmidt and Dave McNally, and the arbitrator, Peter Seitz, decides, the players are right on this. And that blows the whole thing open. And it's from there that free agency emerges, where players then can, for the first time and periodically, be able to declare themselves free agents and be able to sell their services to the highest bidder.
All right, so two wind-up questions then, because this clearly you've done a yeoman's like work to actually truncate this story that's obviously much more involved in the book. And it's a fascinating thread. I guess the question generally I would have, the first one is, why do you think it took so long to get to that point? Given the various attempts, and you mentioned them going all the way back into the late 1800s and some challenger leagues and stuff. And why do you think it took so long? And Gardella's precedent that was sort of almost persistently reminding people that this wasn't fully baked to last so long. What was it? The time? Was it the era? Was it just? Why do you think it took so long to fundamentally kind of achieve what Gardella was after back in the late 1940s?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think that first of all, the challenges that occurred in the 50s and 60s before Curt Flood stepped up were all in the minor leagues. So they weren't getting very much publicity. And to the extent that there were any sort of talk about oh, the reserve clause is unjust and the antitrust exemption is inappropriate. There's just a really strong sort of propaganda campaign going on, and again, not suggesting it was necessarily very closely coordinated, but the sports writers were all on board on this, and they were just parroting whatever the owners were saying, and so there wasn't sort of this space for people being able to really sort of reconsider whether this was legitimate or not, whether this was fair, whether this was even necessary. I mean, the owners are making a ton of money. They've been making a ton of money after free agency, when they had said that if they allowed this to happen, that the whole sport would fall apart. So there just wasn't, I think, in the environment, and I guess the most important thing maybe is that the players, again, didn't have a consciousness that they were being exploited, and so the major leaguers, right? So it wasn't until Curt Flood that someone at that level was again saying, "Hey, this is just not fair," and I think Miller had begun to illustrate for the players what their value was and what they might accomplish if they actually stuck together. And then Curt Flood came along to sort of move that to the next step.
And that leads to my final question, to your delight, I'm sure, is the notion of why it has taken so long for the story of Danny Gardella to kind of become more widely known and perhaps even recognized as being a foundational pillar, perhaps after years of not knowing, for what is ultimately a relatively successful player labor movement over the decades.
Well, yes, I think the reason is because I think his role was neglected. I think that to the extent that some people who have really sort of looked at this know that he had a part in this, they, I think, maybe feel that, well, that to make the connection, this was like 20 years before. You had to look at just what really happened in the 70s, and I just don't feel that way. I feel that, change doesn't happen overnight, and there are certain things that are stepping stones for what are, eventual changes. And so I think that's part of the reason why he was neglected, to the extent that he was known by people. He's not given the credit that he should have gotten, I think. And then a lot of people just don't know at all about him. There were a few sports writers along the way that I found who, between the 70s and now, would occasionally say, when we look back on all the riches that both the players and the owners are getting now in baseball, maybe we ought to think a little bit more about who all was involved besides Curt Flood and Marvin Miller. And sometimes Gardella does pop up, and some sports writers want to give credit, but it's just here and there. And so what I was hoping is to put it together as a package, a combination of what this guy contributed on the one hand and what a fascinating character he was on the other hand. And coincidentally, this is the 50th anniversary of free agency. So I think to the extent that the major leagues are going to recognize that, I think really Gardella ought to be mentioned as part of it.
All right, many thanks to Rob for an enlightening conversation and a whole bunch of interesting background on a guy that I think most people have completely forgotten and need not forget anymore, because you go back and try to figure out how the reserve clause essentially prevented players from any kind of flexibility and the suppression of their rights and wages and all that kind of stuff. And now, you see what has happened since with with Kurt Flood and Marvin Miller and all that kind of stuff, and the salaries and the Players Association. I mean, it's never been a better time to be a ball player in this day and age, especially as private equity and all kinds of other monies start flowing into on a greater extent into pro sports and baseball in particular. Fascinating stuff, all of this and more available for you to read about in the very enlightening book called Dangerous Danny Gardella, Baseball's Neglected Trailblazer for Today's Millionaire Athletes. It is published by our friends at Rowman and Littlefield. It is available wherever fine books are found. Of course, your local independent bookseller in your town, good place to order it and purchase it too. But if you want to get it through our friends at Amazon as quickly as possible in either hardcover or Kindle versions, well, by all means do so. But maybe even going through our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com, just search up this episode number 407 with me and Rob. You'll find a couple of convenient links that will give us a couple of shekels of referral love when you purchase it through such links. And we appreciate that very much. Helps keeps our lights on and all that kind of stuff. Our email address, please, by all means, we're at hello@goodseatsstillavailable.com. You can send us some stuff if you'd like. Happy to converse with you and trade notes and whatever's on your mind. Our socials, let's see, we're on we are on, I'm trying to say it's the Twitter X thing. There you go. At Good Seats Still. You'll see us there. You'll see us on Blue Sky, probably our most active site. We're at goodseatsstillavailable.com there. You will find us just about everywhere else at Good Seats Still Available, all one word, including on YouTube, where we post all these episodes too for you to stream and listen to. In addition to your favorite podcast feed player / catcher, whatever. Make sure that you're following us or subscribe to us in those places, and tell your friends to do the same thing. And if you want to send us a 5-star review or some other thumbs up or whatever, we appreciate that too. That helps other people like you find this here little show and enjoy it hopefully as much as you do and as we enjoy doing it for you. Our thanks, of course, as always, to the great Jerry Payne for his audio excellence this week. And thanks very much for listening, and lots of great stuff coming your way in the months ahead, especially as we get into fall. I hope you're having a good near end of summer, and we'll see you soon here on the feeds. Bye.